Now, Tracey has been Director of Sense About Science since 2002, and under her leadership, the charity has turned the case for sound science and evidence into popular campaigns to urge scientific thinking about the public, and most importantly, the people who answer to the public. Sense About Science under her leadership has launched important initiatives to expand and protect honest discussions of evidence, it's challenged opinions, it's changed the behaviour of governments, media and corporations in the use of scientific evidence. Tracey is involved in many other vital organisations and initiatives, and in 2017 was made an OBE for services to science. And just earlier this year, she's joined UKRIO as one of our trustees, and we're delighted she's chosen to work with us. Tracey, thank you very much. Welcome to the conference. I'll just stop my screen sharing, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, James. Thank you for such a brilliant welcome. That was lovely. I'm going to just take a second to share my slides with you. So I'm going to talk about helping the public to navigate research integrity, but more than navigate, actually, to advocate for research integrity, and you'll see why I think that's important. What I want to do is draw from sort of 20 years of Sense About Science's experience of engaging the public. One might say lessons from the front line of esoteric causes, because what we have tended to do is to take things that everyone thinks you can't talk to the public about. Nearly every campaign I've ever been involved in has started with people telling me that you can't do that and that people aren't interested. So I want to share some of those things with you about what it is possible to talk to the public about. I'll give you a clue, the answer's a lot. For those of you not familiar with Sense About Science, we promote the public interest in sound science and evidence. And the way we do that is that we equip people. I'm having a little trouble moving on here. Here we go. There we go. We equip people equip the public to ask good questions. And this is our Ask for Evidence campaign, which gives people help in asking advertisers, media, politicians, organisations, anyone else who kind of affects and shapes their lives and their public environment, questions about the evidence behind claims that they make. So we equip people to ask good questions, and we equip researchers to preempt those questions and to answer them in human. And so we work with them to think about the ways that their research is going to land in society, and to speak about that in a way that others can get to grips with the evidence behind an area, such as you can imagine, testing and many other areas that we've worked in over the last year have been really important to many members of the public. And in fact, I would say this last year, our capacity to talk to the public about really tricky areas such as modelling and forecasting has expanded enormously in a way that I don't think anybody in research fields could anticipate in the past. So we equip the public, we equip researchers to speak with the public, and we work with both to advocate for system change and a healthy and open environment in which to talk about research. What that means is thinking about things like, how do we look at the kind of quality assurance processes that go on around science that finds its way into the public domain. So this is peer review, and we have popularised the concept of peer review. It's something that was not well understood about 15 years ago when we started talking about it. It was rarely asked for by journalists when they were talking to people making claims about their studies. Now creating a bit of a discussion about, well, more than a big discussion about the systems through which research finds its way into the public domain, and understanding that it's not just important to ask, what did a study find, but what kind of weight can we put on that? What's the status of that research? Similarly, with system change, we look for places where people are struggling to get access to that body of evidence that's generated by research. So this is our All Trials campaign, which started around 7 years ago and has resulted in changes to the European medicines regulations, the UK as well, to the FDA regulation of trial reporting in the US, and has resulted in moving us from a situation where less than half of trials were being reported to far, far more than that. And it's a campaign that involved millions of patients around the world and hundreds of organisations. So we advocate together, and that's one of the best ways to get everybody talking about issues of research and research integrity and research quality. So given all that, you might think that we sort of welcome findings like this. This is a piece of research that was done by Pew and published last year about the kind of skepticism or cynicism that people have, and I would say bend and stick at the moment more towards cynicism about the way that researchers behave. The concern that not everything you read can be trusted, concern that people don't necessarily conduct themselves properly. You think that perhaps we are glad that the public is looking so critically and with such a critical eye at the outputs of research, given that we would all like to see research being higher quality, reliable, done well, and with integrity. But not at all. I think cynicism is something that we need really to think about here, because at the moment that I would say the status, this is quite representative of the fact that there's a lot of sort of shrugging when it comes to a conversation about why some research is better than others, or whether we can be confident in the way that research is done. If you look at the sort of the more popular end of the way that the reproducibility crisis found its way into public discussion, it was highly cynical. And certainly when you take that out into kind of social media discussions and alternative news sources, it's a very dismissive kind of environment when people talk about whether or not interests are declared, whether the funding of research has dictated the outcome, and so on. Those are things that people are largely cynical about in a throwaway kind of a way. And contrary to the sort of the perhaps self-belief of journalists who like to put sort of this sort of story across, cynicism doesn't lead to research integrity. So the suggestion that everybody might be up to something not so good, it doesn't actually take us closer to research integrity. It's tempting to think that we should welcome the kind of end of deference, and of course it is great to see a society that is more questioning, and that we don't just take what somebody tells us in the medical profession absolutely on trust. We do question it. We do have an informed patient ethos that is to be welcomed. But it's tempting to think that it's a great thing when we're talking about how unreliable research is. But we need to take great care in this area, because actually cynicism is about withdrawal from the public domain. And when we start to talk about, well, all of research is unreliable, or when we start to say, well, money makes everything go round, what we're doing really is we're abdicating our collective responsibility to ask more searching questions and more specific questions. Because if everything is wrong, then nothing is. And what we need to do if we want to encourage people to think critically about research integrity and to back the right behaviours and to outlaw others, is to ask much more directed questions. So what I think the challenge for us is here is, how do we socialise research integrity? And the answer, I think, lies in talking about research that's well done, as well as talking about what the concepts of research integrity are, and including the architecture. And it means challenging cynicism, and that means talking about limits and equipping people with the right questions. And I'm going to just tell you a bit about some of the ways in which I think that works. So what do I mean by socialise research integrity? I mean engage people in actually making the distinctions between the behaviours that we want and the behaviours that we don't, that those things that we think are problematic and not, And why engage them? You know, you could very easily think, well, actually, this is surely an issue. It's an internal issue to research. It's an internal issue to institutions. These things are best done always, you know, best talked about always, you know, in small circles. And in fact, there's a danger, and I know that many researchers sort of privately think this, there's a real danger of washing your dirty linen in public. There's a real danger of talking about some of the problems for fear that people then cast the net too wide in their belief that research is unreliable. And I'm not talking about sort of washing, you know, necessarily having no discretion in the pursuit of a particular issue. I'm talking about actually helping people to think about what is and isn't desirable. And the reason for this isn't simply to have a well-informed public. It's actually that stuff doesn't move in society unless we feel that there is a public audience for it, that people don't start asking those right questions unless they feel very motivated by it. And I think one of the one of the best examples of this for me is advocating for transparency about the evidence behind policy. You know, this is something that Sense About Science and the Institute for Government developed as a framework for government departments. And we then spot checked, we did 2 big spot checks across government departments to look at how well they publish the evidence behind their policy proposals. This sort of thing leads to behaviour change. And one of the reasons why it has, and between the 2 spot checks, there was considerable behaviour change. One of the reasons why is because we engaged people around the UK in scoring whether or not a motivated citizen could find their way to the evidence behind the policy proposal. And it was because this was a popular public conversation. We got the ear immediately of departments, and not just because they were defensive, but actually also because there were rewards to be gained. There was an obvious interest in if you put that extra effort in to helping people, that you got the congratulations of coming up green on this screen. And as a result of that, you know, we've seen changes to the Treasury Green Book about policy making and so on. Recognising that there is a public interest issue here is a big motivator of change. So cynicism doesn't help research integrity. It's withdrawal from the public space. It diminishes the questions that people ask. It reduces the anticipation of those questions by institutions. And overall, it diminishes the expectations of standards and public duty. But the converse of that, I mean, the domain of behaviour change, those things are all pretty bad to have. But the converse of that is that encouraging people to engage with these questions, making them a popular public discussion, brings with it the rewards for good behaviour, the rewards for applying standards, the effort being worth it, and so on. Similarly, what do I mean by rewarding good behaviour? I think we spend so much time when we're looking to tackle a problem, we spend so much time describing what bad looks like and not enough time describing what good looks like. And this is the EU trials tracker that we developed with all trials for with the EBM Data Lab. EBM Data Lab at Oxford developed it, and we absorbed it into the all trials campaign. And this is a fantastic way of showing who's doing what and well. And what it has meant is that pharmaceutical companies who until last year didn't really ever get much applause have been able to show that, having had a really quite worrying way of reporting their trials in the past, when they turned that around as we began to change European law, we recognised it, and people were able to see that they appeared in the top, 100% reported. So it's really important to talk about what does good look like, and are we actually recognising and commending good. And when we take that into a research integrity environment, we think about those people, those organisations that that do adhere to standards, that do look to adopt systems and processes that are reassuring for their colleagues, for employees, for the public. So when we think about what we mean by socialised, and we also need to talk about the architecture and realise that when we describe research in the public domain, we so often forget to talk about things like why we're doing this, what problem it is we're trying to solve, what are the rules and regulations that frame our research, what standards are we adhering to, what reporting we're going to be doing. This is the British Geological Survey's UKGEOS, UK Geo-Energy Observatories, which are in Cheshire and Glasgow. And we worked with them to engage the local community in designing the interface with that research infrastructure, so that it's possible for everyone who's concerned about it and thinking about, environmentally concerned about it and concerned about having such a big piece of infrastructure in their community, can actually look at and understand and share and track and discuss what this research is for and what progress is being made. And they worked with us to co-create the interface for UKGEOS. But we forget so often that there are assumptions that we are making about the reliability of the research that we're doing and talking about. This is a project which I undertook with parents of children undergoing heart surgery. Some of you will remember that in the UK, more than a decade ago, 2 decades ago, in fact, the relationship between families of children with heart problems and the medical establishment and the government was very fraught because of incidents that had happened at Alderhay and at Bristol with organ retention and other concerns about treatment. What that led to was a situation where the government knee-jerk kind of started publishing the outcomes of children of surgical units to sort of allow parents to have choice and to compare them. But of course, when we end up seeing parents traveling halfway across the country with very sick children in search of better surgical outcomes, when in fact, actually perhaps they were going to a unit that took less complicated cases. There was an effort a few years ago to then rewrite the formula to mathematically look better at the outcomes and to help people to anticipate what effect having surgery, the choice to have surgery, would have on their children. So we worked with the team at UCL to produce understanding children's heart surgery outcomes, but most importantly, we worked with parents whose children were undergoing heart surgery. And they pretty much, again, took on designing the interface with that. Very interesting thing for us was that they didn't want to see, huge amounts of caveats and all of what scientists wanted to tell them about in relation to the mathematics and so on. But they were very good at explaining something like predicted range. And in fact, the explanation for predicted range on this site is from them. They explained back to us what it was and what it meant to them and used their own language. But what they also did was they sorted the information. And the key thing that came out of it was they didn't want to redo the statistics themselves, but what they wanted to know was that anyone who could do that would be able to see what they needed to see. So they wanted to know that it's actually possible for anyone who can delve into these things to do so. They wanted all of that assurance about the architecture around this. What confirmation do I have that other people could look at this, that the statistics aren't hidden? What is it that makes this, gives me confidence in this? That's what they wanted to see. So that kind of area around it, which most of the researchers involved actually took for granted because it was their world that they worked in, and it was a missing piece as far as those patients were concerned. And in fact, it was such a successful engagement, despite this very, very narrow and difficult subject area, that when that was launched, it ended up being pretty much launched by the parents and the patient groups themselves. So include the architecture. And I think that's perhaps the biggest message there, that I just think we say so little about the constraints within which research is done, and the rules and the standards and the professional practices that we abide by in doing research. None of that comes across. We just don't talk about it at all when we're promoting new results and putting them out through journals, or journals are doing their PR, university press offices are sending things out. That's just missing, and we just have so much more to say about that. I think including that starts to create an air of expectation that we're able to comment on things like these results are being published, but we expect people to comment on them and develop them further, and then so forth. I'm going to skip this one. We also need to talk about the limits. Actually, I'll talk about this. We need to talk about the limits of research, so that these are things which are not accidentally caught up in discussions about research integrity. So in the public mind, sort of failings in research are akin to not knowing the answer to a question as well. So it's very important to own those limits and to say why we cannot answer some questions fully, and to distinguish very much the limits and sort of transient and partial bits of knowledge in research from those things which arise because things aren't well done. We really would, I suppose, the dream situation to get to would be where the public can tell the difference between a study that was poorly designed and, or we can talk about the difference between a study that was poorly designed and wouldn't find an answer to the question it set because it wasn't statistically powered to do so, or some other methodological flaw, or it was biased. That's different from being unable to make certain conclusions from the limitations of the data we have, and we need to be able to talk about those things more. This is a small area health statistics unit at Imperial who worked with us on publishing their atlases of health effects and health conditions and environmental factors. And I highlight this because what a great success this was. They absolutely, working with everyone from midwives, we brought in local counsellors and local journalists and all the sorts of people you would expect to just overlay these maps and start making causal connections between them. We brought all of them in to work on the maps with us, and the result of that was that nobody did an overlay story of suggesting that because there's density here, there'll be density there, and suggesting that incinerators cause breast cancer, for example, when in fact what we're really seeing is that's London, and there's just density in both. So it's a very successful ownership of the limitations of the research, and it didn't at all get caught up in any other sort of wider cynicism or wider discussion. Uncertainty is a very big part of this too, and I think talking to people about the uncertainties in your research, and again distinguishing those from things which are sort of in the world of malpractice and integrity is different. And I think again rescuing that and taking it away and saying, well, actually there are limits to research, and we would expect things. We would expect studies to be overturned in the area of consciousness, for example, in the very unsettled domains of science. We expect findings to be overturned regularly. That is different. And we expect even mistakes to be made methodologically in those areas because people are finding new ways to investigate. That is very different from questions of research integrity. So again, I think making that distinction and owning those differences are really important. And equipping people with the questions. I think there are areas where we talk about public engagement so much these days, and yet there are whole areas where people are so ill-equipped. We have algorithms making decisions in every government department, every local authority at the moment, and so few people, even in government procurement, never mind the media and the wider public who's affected by these decisions, know how to ask the question, what's this based on? And so whether it's mortgage decisions or deciding which prisoners to release early or working out new road systems, data science is being used all the time, and yet so few people are well equipped. So I think equipping people with good questions to ask is a crucial part of this. And part of that is equipping them with the questions to ask about the research integrity. And I think one of the areas that we have a big gap in is looking at that whole area of how we use data and what we consider to be the standards that should be adopted there. There is no agreement and no conversation really to speak of outside of some really narrow circles. So there are areas where I think there's a lot of work for the research community to do productively to equip society with specific and good questions about key areas of research. And I'll finish with a virtuous circle, which is that in giving people the questions to ask, even if you don't think they're able to fully appreciate the answers, it's a journey we're taking together and it's a conversation that we have. But the most important part of getting people to ask questions is that everybody in the research community anticipates those questions. And this is always the stuff of behaviour change, which is asking the question is the crucial, and internalizing those questions. Effectively, what we're saying is internalizing scrutiny. And in that sense, it's not just a question of engaging the public for their own good, or to improve the nature of public discussion about research. It's that we need the public to operationalize research integrity. Thank you.
Tracey, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And it's also very interesting to hear about sort of both the broader work of Sense About Science, and so much of it is about, you know, improving public understanding and trust of research, and that's essential to research integrity. It's not just about what we do as researchers, it's how we communicate it, and communicate it beyond the traditional routes of, say, research dissemination, and also how that communication and our outputs are picked up on and commented on and sort of felt about. Even the, not just the intellectual understanding, but the emotional reaction that research can generate. All this stuff is so important and so intertwined with the issue of making sure our research is considered good in terms of practice. So thank you very much. We've already had some questions come in. Please add more. We've got about 20 minutes for questions and discussion, so hit that Q&A button and get them in. We've got a few questions in already. The first one, ask about the work of Sense About Science. Do you work on issues relating to claims from non-science research areas where integrity is also relevant? You know, the arts, humanities, social sciences and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for us, that we use perhaps the French definition of science, which is, you know, a mode of inquiry across all areas of life. And I think one of the things that, I mean, I come from a social science background, and one of the things that I find immensely frustrating, actually, I mean, taking the COVID period of recent, is how readily some scientists who are great advocates of expertise and evidence in their domain will just use a load of cod sociology when it comes to commenting on wider society. And I just think it's, you know, there's a case to be made there for standards in, you know, in history and in sociology, just as much anywhere else, and the use of evidence, and that there are, you know, methodologies to understand things. And I feel that sometimes the sort of natural sciences is rather dismissive of those methods, or sort of plonk something down like everybody thinks, you know. If I sort of had a tray of samples and said, oh, they're probably all positive, somebody would say, what are you talking about? But it's okay to come along and say everybody thinks, without any reference to what to any evidence. And so I do think that there's a case to be made for standards being really just as important in those areas.
I think that's a very good point, especially in, for some time, I think discussions of science, especially in relation to issues such as climate change and like, has often been almost to a degree weaponized by politicians, commentators and like. And I think we're living in apparently an area of the so-called culture war. We now see issues of history being and culture and social sciences being used in the same way. So I think it's very important to have those discussions. Thank you. Another question, there's substantial work with regards to reporting of clinical research and patient engagement. Are you aware of things happening along similar lines regarding sort of non-clinical research? Because that can have a huge impact on society as well. And so, you know, sort of engagement with the public regarding non-clinical research. And like, I think this is still in the area of, sort of, you know, the sciences.
So am I aware of work that's going on outside of patient engagement? Is that the question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
that's outside clinical research, yeah.
Huge amount of what we do. So we've been working, so we have a whole series of public engagement partnerships where researchers are working on something that we think is a major public interest issue, and there's real scope for it to be misunderstood, not well used, misrepresented, and so on. We will partner with those organisations, and so we've been working with the LSE on understanding deprivation, and we've been and engaging the public in understanding in that piece of research. We're big fans of bringing people in early in those discussions, and And, you know, there is always that awkward moment where researchers think, well, they haven't got PhDs, and not really quite sure how we're going to have this conversation. But actually, just even beginning to talk to people about what problem it is you're trying to solve and what you expect to come out of the end of your research, and what kind of definitions you're using and all those sorts of things. There's huge amounts that are gained in insight in those areas. We work with, I mentioned UKGEOS, which is working with geologists. We also run Evidence Week in Parliament, which is a thing we started 3 or 4 years ago, which brings research groups around the UK working on those sorts of subjects which are likely to be policy questions. And what we do is we work with them and with constituents from around the UK to encourage MPs to come along, to equip themselves with the questions you need for 21st century policy making. You know, if you think about this, we've got, and so I'm being very UK centric here, but it's true. Also, we've worked with colleagues in the Netherlands, in the US, and other places trying to do a similar thing. Your parliaments or your legislatures are being asked to scrutinise, often to also represent people at the same time. So they're being asked to scrutinise. They might be looking at something like a transport bill and air quality, right? And then suddenly 5 minutes later, they're looking at something to do with local access to healthcare. And then they're looking at, you know, it's just like one thing after, they're moving across all these subjects. Government departments have whole swathes of people analysing and working on the subject matter. How is the one supposed to scrutinise the other? You know, we need the tools of 21st century science to do that. We need to, you know, MPs need to know how to disaggregate data on free school meals and look at things like air quality changes and things like this. So working with research groups across all of these areas and being led by the questions. We have a sort of a mantra of public-led, expert-fed, which is being led by the questions that are going to come up. And inevitably that means well outside of, you know, medical science.
Thank you. I had 2 questions relating to dealing with the press. Anonymous questioner says, you know, should science journalists take more responsibility for relaying accurate reports, and also that press releases from universities that present research that's yet to be peer reviewed can be misleading, you know, and similar to preprints, they can be given weighting perhaps by the media which they're not quite ready for. How can we present this from misleading the general public? And Jane asks, and this is related to, you know, do researchers need more training and support when dealing with the media, especially if they're, you know, because she cites examples where she's seen researchers kind of backed into corners in press interviews a bit, for example.
Yeah, I mean, so that's kind of 2 questions about the press office, really, because so for one thing, I think it's really important to help press officers, you know, to understand that when they're communicating science, there's a lot of other stuff they need to be communicating. So sexing up the findings can lead to misrepresentation. And I can't tell you the number of times that I have challenged a journalist only for them to send me the press release that they've been sent. And I realised that the problem started somewhere further back with the university or with the journal that put the story out in the first place. I mean, journals tend to be a bit more aware of their limitations, but it's really important to understand that, and that people will come into those roles not necessarily having worked with communicating the fruits of research previously. So perhaps every institution should be looking at its induction for those members of staff. On the other hand, I would say, what a brilliant thing for you as researchers that you have often many brilliant press officers who are able to hold your hand through those experiences and help you anticipate discussions with journalists. And we've seen a lot of scientists kind of suddenly thrown out into the spotlight or finding themselves, you know, being consulted by the media over the last year. A lot of researchers in, you know, not just in virology or whatever you say, in education and other affected areas. And, you know, that I think I would say that by and large, misrepresentation hasn't been terrible. I think people have actually been fairly well represented. There haven't been that many big stories of people being you know, people's words being twisted. I think it's been pretty good. I would also say, I think journalists, particularly if you talk to specialist journalists do a great job. I mean, their job though is to interest people in a story. And when you go into it, if you're going to have a talk with a journalist, you think about the fact that what they want to come out of the end of it with is a story, right? So if you're not going to give them an interesting story, they'll find one or they'll make a different one. So, you know, if you anticipate that, you think, okay, it's no point in me having a conversation that just says, no, that's not a story, that's not a story. You need to think, what is interesting about this? And give them the real interesting bit rather than leave it to chance that they're going to find the right question. So I think there's a bit of better understanding there could go on, is to realise ultimately media is entertainment.
Thank you. Do you think there's an element of ensuring both amongst the media and the public that research is an incremental process rather than always about big discoveries? You know, there's kind of the danger of overhype. Do you think in general perhaps there's poor knowledge or good new knowledge of kind of the research process and the limits and constraints that come with it? Or should there be more education in perhaps secondary education on, you know, what is research?
Well, that's a fantastic thing. I mean, to talk properly about what research is, and I showed that the settled, unsettled span. I think even just giving people a sense of that is a good way of helping us locate the conversations about why some research changes quickly. The pandemic has been a rapid education of society in this, really has.
Yeah.
And I would say that people have been largely very mature and quite restrained about understanding that. I think now we're kind of in the bit where the wheels fall off and there's a lot of recrimination, but actually it's important to remember that there was a very big period at the start of the pandemic where people showed a lot of restraint and a lot of respect for being in the position of having to make decisions based on, you know, very incomplete knowledge. And I think the public was pretty impressive in their ability to handle that.
Yes, I remember a survey publicised by The Guardian about a year ago saying that public trust in researchers was actually incredibly high. They just wanted to be able to ideally see the data so they could sort of, you know, through interpretation, make their own understanding of it. So know that it wasn't kind of, they weren't being asked to make changes to life based on sort of hidden facts and figures that no
I think transparency was certainly an issue.
Absolutely, thank you. And now you talked about COVID. A questioner asked, in terms of non-COVID related stuff, what are you kind of most concerned about with your Sense About Science hat on? Because obviously the COVID is very much in the public mind. How do you, are there other issues that might kind of always go under the radar? And how do you get the public to concentrate on sort of off-trend events, as it were?
Well, I've flagged up data science, and I think that guide that we produced was the first guide in the world, public guide in the world to data science. And I just can't describe enough the gap between everyone wanting to talk about public engagement and dialogue, and then this whole swathe of stuff that nobody's talking about. It feels to me like data science is where medicine was in the 70s. Where a small number of people know too much to explain to the dummies like the rest of us, and we all feel too dumb to ask. I mean, that's kind of where things are at the minute, to the point where you have politicians, sort of EU level, every country has politicians sort of announcing data strategies, and you can feel that they've gone beyond the point where they can say, what is big data? But actually everybody wants to ask that. You have press conferences where journalists feel like, I'm going to be the one who says, what actually is this? And so we're allowing stuff to go on without understanding the checks and balances. Great example of it at the start of the pandemic in the UK was people's frustrations with the flu models. I'm sorry to come back to the pandemic, but it's actually relevant to everything else. And just the basic, and it wasn't simply the wider public's frustration. It was senior politicians and government procurement as well, and sort of officials and journalists, not realizing that, well, how on earth could you have a model if you didn't have any data to build one with? And so you think, well, okay, if that's not being asked here and understood here, what that means is the whole way in which models are tested is not part of a sort of check and balance. So I'm a big advocate for something we call responsible handover, which is that when you develop the mathematical solution to a problem, it's not immediately rolled out into deciding, whether or not we think a claim for welfare is fraudulent. It's actually, there are proper checks and balances through that. We have openness, accountability. We understand what the limitations of those models are, and at each point at which it's context, the use of that data science is moved, the context change is reevaluated. That's all not a conversation at the minute. I think you look at something like construction, where handover, the whole conversation about, was this done to spec? Was it done for the right context? But that signing off, if Transport for London commissions a new station, the signing off process is bigger than the construction process.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we need to think about in relation to data science, that those conversations are not happening all the way through.
A handover and checking for snagging afterwards, as construction says. Thank you. Inca asks, thank you for talking, said, how do you take what you shared with us today to kind of educate everyone on how to sort of question effectively people who try and troll about outputs of research, potential breaches of research integrity, like, how to engage with people who are perhaps have a particular agenda and a bit kind of combative?
That's a really good question. And it really is very similar to dealing with conspiracy theories, actually. We're just about to publish something. We've been working with people who are minded towards conspiracy theories to write the guide on how to have a conversation with them. So I'm talking about people who've not got a lot of skin in the game particularly, but are curious, feel that they don't get the whole story. And how can they have more productive conversations? So I think the crucial thing that comes out of that is also just spotting really where your time's well spent, because obviously what you don't want to do is just become part of someone's baiting exercise. And so there's some guidance in there and some sort of insights into how to have those conversations. But I think you can pretty quickly, sometimes people say things, they ask questions as a form of protest, and the thing that they're protesting about is not wrong. They're maybe telling you that they feel cut out. They're telling you that they don't feel that anyone in public life represents them. And that's not a wrong thing. It's just coming out in a way that kind of is expressed as a sort of sneering question about research or something like that. And I think sometimes what we can do is think, well, actually, if people feel like that, research has a long and noble history of equipping people with the right questions to ask, that to get them closer to understanding their situation. When John Pullinger was the national statistician of the UK, he set up ONS. He introduced looking at areas of deprivation and giving people the statistics to describe their experience. And people thanked him for it. I mean, there was the opportunity then to actually say, this is our lived existence. And now suddenly I've got the proof to describe it to policymakers and to our local authority and so on. But before that, it was coming out, lashing out in all sorts of, questions, and people will sometimes do things just as they'll suddenly object to a development in their, or a mast, or, but you think, well, what are they really telling you here, and how can we equip them with better questions?
That's fascinating. Thank you. To give people evidence where previously they just had anecdote, and to look at the underlying causes of why they're saying what they're saying. Brilliant. I think we've got time for one final question, which I'm going to expand on. Kate asks, when considering the training of sort of future researchers, what training do you think we should provide them in terms of helping them, disseminate with the public, engage with the public, and consider the public in their work? But I think I'd like to expand the question, because this isn't just about the early career researchers who perhaps are hopefully coming of age in a research environment which considers these issues a bit more. For the people who've been doing this for a while, the potential dinosaurs, I'm pointing at myself in this, what can we provide to not just the ECRs but also the more experienced researchers to help them engage with, disseminate with, and consider the public in their work?
Okay, two very short things, because it's such a good question. Number one, I think you can start engaging people with your question, don't start engaging people with your answer, and then to a question they never knew they had. So start work on engaging people at your question level. Why is this question important? Why am I trying to answer it? And I think go from there. So that's the most important thing. And I would secondly say, please advocate for engagement being about helping us to raise the standard in public life, rather than just rah, 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 here's my research. It's not a show and tell of your research. I mean, don't expect people to think that's great, I think what you have to start with is say, what questions can I engage people in that are important for us? And why, and I think that would be so much better if we could talk about the need to improve our collective conversation rather than simply the whiz bang wow of what I've just found. So.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I think the last point about this isn't rah-rah is quite important, because I think sometimes within institutions there can be pressure. Oh, do your public engagement, you must shout about how great your research is, and by subject how great this organisation is. I think so the messaging about this, and there's a comment from Richie in the chat that, you know, all this is very worthwhile stuff, definitely, but it takes time. So institutions will need to provide, as well as training and support, time for their researchers to consider these issues and engage with them in the ways that you described. It's fascinating. Thank you very much. Final practical question. A lot of people in the chat are asking about the forthcoming Sense About Science stuff that you've mentioned. I'm assuming if they go to the Sense About Science website, there's a newsletter or something they can sign up to, so they get notification of the publication.
Yes, and follow us on Twitter on @SenseAboutSci, and you'll be the first to know. So.
Okay, we'll circulate some links in the chat stream. Tracey, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. To those who've asked questions that we didn't have time to answer, Tracey has joined UKRIO. She's a trustee now. She belongs to us, he says laughing evilly. So we will be doing a lot more on these types of issues as an organisation, and we will try and follow up on the questions and issues you've raised today that we didn't have time to answer. Tracey, thank you so much. Been a brilliant talk, lots of lovely feedback in the chat and on social media. So yes, it's been your baptism of fire for UKRIO as an end. It's great to have you on board, and thank you so much for speaking with us today.